Okay, as we said, Bishop Matthew ordained all by himself, considering himself being persecuted, although in reality he was the only bishop that was never persecuted. And this was done deliberately by the state church because he was probably making a fool of the old calendars. And they said, leave him alone, he's in the convent, just leave him alone. Whereas the other bishops, they were sent in exile, they were put in prison, they were maltreated, but Bishop Matthew was not. And you see that even till now, our days, that the state church would want and to ridicule the old calendars. All this started with Matthew. They let him alone because they probably thought he was a little bit not there. And so he ordained by himself, even though there were bishops just a few hours away from him, but he thought that he was the only bishop left on earth because he had condemned the Orthodox Church for being in communion with the Numinaianists, those who had taken the new calendar for the Mannaean. The holy canons bore witness against him, seeing that both Metropolitan Chrysostom and Metropolitan Germanos had never been deposed, had never been put on trial, were not preaching heresy, were not in communion with heretics, but he considered them not true bishops. Therefore, now you got to look at the logic of Matthew in a way. He is saying that God's providence, God's almighty power, could not work to sustain his church, so that one bishop other than Matthew can be found to ordain another bishop. He had to do it on himself, by himself. In other words, God had to break his own canons so that Matthew could ordain by himself. This is illogical. God had to cooperate with Matthew to break his own canon, to break God's own canon, and think it's permissible. So his church, his schismatic church, can continue. So after a few more years, Matthew was approaching his death. And what happened? Metropolitan Chrysostom went to his bedside and to try to have some words of reconciliation with him and perhaps to correct this problem, this schism, because for a schism to be made in the church is a great sin. So Metropolitan Chrysostom went to Keratea, entered the convent, they opened it for him. Only one thing, the abbess Mariam was not present. And so he was escorted to the room of Bishop Matthew. And Bishop Matthew saw him, was delighted. And he said to him, and this was bore witness to by many, he said to him, "Why are we divided?" he said to Metropolitan Chrysostom. So Metropolitan Chrysostom left being very encouraged, and he probably went back, reported to the other bishops that there's probably a reconciliation because Bishop Matthew said, "Why are we divided?" and made inclinations for some kind of reconciliation. So Metropolitan Chrysostom came back the second time. This time the abbess Mariam was present. And Bishop Matthew turned his face away from Metropolitan Chrysostom, with no words of reconciliation this time. And the Abbess Mariam asked the Metropolitan if he would now leave the convent. And so he was escorted out, and the two bishops never met again. And Bishop Matthew, the Vicar Bishop Matthew, forever lost an opportunity to correct all his previous errors, because Metropolitan Chrysostom of Florina wanted to help him. He knew that the man was not acting rationally. Okay. After Bishop Matthew died, Metropolitan Chrysostom again tried to make a reconciliation. And he did it by proclaiming exactly what the Matthewites wanted. They wanted Metropolitan Chrysostom to say that the new calendars were graceless. And if he did that, they said reconciliation was possible. And so Metropolitan Chrysostom, a really loving and caring person for these people, to bring them back into the church, decided he was going to say that for their benefit, but not go to the extent that the new calendars, those who followed the new calendar, were graceless right from the very beginning, from 1924, because that's illogical. But when that happened, they rejected him. They rejected his overtures for reconciliation with them. Now, this is a very bad thing, because when someone repents and does everything the way you request them to do, and you reject them, I think the Holy Apostle said this is like Cain killing Abel, and blood is on their hands. And they say, if it's such a sin to make a schism, how much more is it a sin to prevent a schism from healing? So the Matthewites, continuing on the stubborn way of their leader, rejected the overtures for reconciliation by Metropolitan Chrysostom of Florina. Now, everything, let me repeat, Metropolitan Chrysostom did his change of statements in the most public and humbling way possible, by taking all the blame on himself. Even after all of this, the Matthewites still called him an apostate and refused to unite with him. Since all possible stumbling blocks had been removed, the only obstacle that separated the Matthewites from the church now was their irrational hatred and pride. That's how it was, and it's a shame. Now, continuing. Nothing was more controversial than the uncovering of Bishop Matthew's remains, because I don't know if everybody knows that, but in Greece, after someone reposes, they're buried, and after 3 years, their remains are removed. And if it's a clergyman, one can tell if he was holy by the relics being incorrupt, and truly holy if the relics are fragrant, and of course if there are any miracles. Then one can tell in this way that this person was righteous before God. Well, the Matthewites knew that if the remains of Matthew were in a deplorable state, their whole schism would crumble. And so they did not want to risk having a public removal of the relics. So they did them, the date was set and the time was set for the gates of the monastery, for the convent to be opened. But, strangely enough, before that time, well before that time, his remains were opened. And there were witnesses. Greece is a small country, and people who see are witnessing something, it's very, very difficult to keep something secret, especially with a public figure like Matthew. And so the abbess and the ardent followers of Bishop Matthew opened his relics before the public was allowed to come in. And now, from witnesses who eventually left because of the various errors of the Matthewites, they spoke and said what happened. They opened the relics, and the relics were horrible. There was a stench. But Mariam, the abbess, was ready with all the necessary procedures or equipment or myrrhs, alloys, and sweet-smelling things to correct any problems. And so she scrubbed the relics, the remains, the bones, and doused them with the oils, the aromatic oils, and then placed back in the hole where they were. And then the doors were opened, and the public came in, and they opened up, was already dug up, but they opened it up, and the fragrance of all the aromatic oils came out, and they saw that the bones were still intact. No other hierarch has ever had such a controversy about the uncovering of the remains of someone. No one in Greece, because it's done in the open. But as we said, if the remains of Matthew were known, then his whole schism would fall apart. The repose of Archbishop Chrysostom was that of a saint. He knew his repose days before, that he was going to die on the Feast of the Virgin Mary. And exactly what happened in 1955, September 8th, according to the church calendar. And then they buried him a few days later. And when they buried him, thousands upon thousands of people gathered to escort him to the grave. And it just so happened that all the bells of Greece were ordered to be rung, not because of him, but the state ordered that they be rung because of an incident that happened in Constantinople, where some Greeks were killed, I think. But it just so happened when they were bringing his body out from the church is when the order was given to ring all the bells of Greece. And they were rung in a solemn mode. And so his body was escorted from the church to the grave at the sounding of all of Greece. And then, of course, 6 years later, when his relics were removed, a great sign that the whole, they were buried in the cemetery of a convent in Athens, and the whole area was filled with this fragrance, just like as happened with Saint Nectarius when they opened his relics. That whole convent in Egina was filled with a fragrance, and the fragrance went down to the road so that passers-byers were smelled. What is this? And they were told that the relics of Saint Nectarius were being opened. Same thing happened with Metropolitan Chrysostom. The whole area was filled with a beautiful fragrance of the relics. Now we come to 1971. The Matthewites have this stigma always on them, because when Metropolitan Chrysostom died, there were no bishops left. He was the last bishop. He did not ordain anybody. And the Greek people said, we would rather have no bishop rather than to go to the Matthewites, because the Matthewites are illogical, irrational, and tramplers of the canons. So for years, about 5 years, they had to have no bishop rather than to go with the Matthewites. And then in 1960, the Russian Church ordained a bishop. That's another story. But the Russian Church abroad under Metropolitan Philaret recognized the Florinite group and entered into communion with them. Then in 1971, the Matthewites, understanding the stigma on them, what did they do? They petitioned. They made a good choice for once. They petitioned for a church to examine their one-handed ordination controversy. But instead of going to the Florinites, who are in communion with the Russian Church abroad, they, because of, who knows, because of pride, because they didn't go down the road to the Florinite Synod. They went halfway around the world and came to New York. 2 bishops were sent by their synod, Callistus and Epiphanius, to petition the Russian Church abroad to examine there. And the Russian Church abroad accepted their request and examined what happened and said that we cannot accept this ordination. It wasn't done properly. It was done against the canons. And the Matthewites agreed that whatever decision the Russian Church would adjudicate, they would obey. And so the Russian Church said, you have to be ordained properly. And they said that 2 bishops would ordain, and with the hereticea, the laying on of hands, Bishop Callistus, and the next day there would be the laying on of hands of Epiphanius, because you cannot ordain more than 1 bishop on 1 liturgy, on 1 altar, on 1 day. So it was done like it should have been done. And this was done in Boston, the monastery in Boston, and we are witnesses. I was there. I saw what happened. And it's undeniable, although the Matthewites now deny it. These prayers of laying on of hands were duly performed on September 17th and September 18th upon the hierarchs Callistus and Epiphanius, as witnessed by all of us. And the Matthewites now say that no, this wasn't the laying on of hands, this was just a prayer of forgiveness, which is, and one should understand, the Matthewites have a history of changing history. We have caught them many times saying things that did not exist, changing photographs, pasting and putting in people that were not there. So when the Matthewites give a history, everybody should be aware that the history is not trustworthy, absolutely not trustworthy. This decision of the Matthewite hierarchy to have their ordinations corrected acknowledges that the ordinations by Matthew were indeed uncanonical and violated all of their statements from 1948 to 1971, where they had maintained that the ordinations of Matthew were indeed true and grace-filled. This had now been proven false by their own actions. Also, the Matthewite interpretation of the Confession of Faith of 1935 had again been put in question, since the Russian Church abroad, who ordained these bishops of the Matthewites and who judged them, did not adhere to the Confession of Faith in 1935, because I say we because we were in the Russian Church abroad, did not say that the new calendars were graceless since 1924. So this is what they did. They went back to Greece. When they were in America, they were all happy that they were ordained and that their ordinations were without question now. But when they went back to Greece, the other bishops of the Matthewites refused to have those two bishops who were corrected in America lay their hands on them. So they continue to say now that it was just a prayer of absolution, but there's no such thing in the Orthodox Church as a prayer of ablution for an uncanonical ordination. There's no such thing.